Welcome to another episode of The Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. We are going to have a great conversation today. The masks are coming off. People are feeling themselves now. We are starting to have some glimmers of hope for the economy opening back up. Maybe soon you will be able to go to Costco and Target and anywhere and walk around just as naked-faced as you want, just as free as you've ever been in your whole life. And with that, is going to be this sense of liberation for people in the public. But how's that going to be for schools and school districts that now have to do some post-COVID work to clean up this really terrifying year that we had in terms of achievement and systems and structures, and which parents are going to come back, which ones aren't going to come back to regular in-person schooling? It seems like we're going to have a massive remediation project for our school leaders. The people who actually lead districts are going to have a more enhanced project than they've ever had in the past. This isn't going to be business as usual and, hey, we're back, let's just do what we were doing before. No, the work's probably going to be a little bit more complicated than that. So I brought in, as I always do, you guys got to know we do this every day, the big guns. So today I have with me Dr. Joshua P. Starr, who's the Chief Executive Officer of PDK International. He's been the president there, or the Chief Executive Officer, excuse me, since July of 2015. He also has a background in educational leadership. He's seen things up close as a superintendent. He understands how school boards work. He knows how the politics and the general public engage and interact with superintendents and school boards. So I can't think of a better person to help me understand this. Good morning, Joshua. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Chris. How you doing?
You know, I'm increasingly worried. I'm worried that I'm always worried about what's next to come. And I know that wise people aren't supposed to worry about something that hasn't come yet. And they're not supposed to harp on the past. But I'm doing both right now. I'm harping on the past, that we've had this really disruptive last year and that the bill hasn't come due yet, educationally speaking, for our leaders who are going to have to clean up the mess this coming fall, while much of the public is in the high spirits of, hey, it's over, or it's kind of over. Our school leaders behind closed doors are going to have a much bigger project to clean up than we're thinking as the general public. So I'll ask you just to start there. Is that a fair analysis, or do you think it's going to be better than what I'm thinking?
Yeah, I think it is a fair analysis. We talk all the time in leadership development work and organizational theory work about adaptive change versus technical change, and technical change is the sort of straightforward challenge of getting stuff done. It happened in the beginning of COVID, right? Kids need to be fed, schools are closed. What do? You feed them. It's hard, it's complex, but it's pretty straightforward. You get meals to kids. And now we're in this adaptive work, right? What does school mean anymore? What does learning mean? What do we do about the fact that COVID has made it so clear that families of color in particular distrust the school system more than ever, while white families, which we've always known, will exercise their political muscle wherever they can? What is it, what's the right role of labor? And how do people see labor, given what's going on? These are really hard challenges. What's the role of a school board versus a superintendent in making some of these decisions? And then how does something like a city council, a county council, a mayor fit in their decision? Where does power lie? Who gets to make decisions? Those are really complex, hairy issues that are always kind of in the underbelly of public, education leadership, but have now been writ large with no easy answers. And in a time when folks are frankly exhausted over their experience of the last year and a half, it's just going to get that much tougher for school system leaders, and I feel for them.
Do you have any fears or worries or concerns about what's going to happen at the state level to make the work either easier or more challenging for the local leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this huge infusion of money, which is great, right? No doubt we need more resources going to schools if they're spent in the right ways, and if they're not spent in the ways that we've always done, right? Which is just buy more stuff, right? Just there's a policy arena and a marketplace that incentivizes people to just buy things and call that
Mm-hmm.
change and call that reform, right? There's an app for that, right? Buy new books. Oh, this program didn't work. Buy another program. So now there's this massive infusion of cash going into school systems through states. States don't have the capacity in many ways. There are good people working in state departments, but it's not like they're set up for this. Neither are school districts. And again, all these competing demands and pressures about how the money should be spent. What does learning loss mean if we even want to use that term? Do you focus on academics or social emotional, even though that's,
Mm-hmm.
a silly dichotomy? HVAC systems, stuff like that. So I think state departments are going to have a real challenge to reconsider what accountability looks like. We've had this kind of squishy accountability system for the last 4 years, give or take. ESSA, there's a lot of nebulousness around
Mm-hmm.
ESSA. So how do you even rethink what accountability system should look like now? How do you rethink what resource allocation methodology should look like? And that's a leadership question. And, some folks are going to do really well. And some folks won't, like we always see, right? And we're going to see more of that as the stakes are higher, and as public education has also been such a huge symbol of the pandemic, and will be seen as part of our collective recovery, right? What kind of leadership do you need? And I don't, to do that well. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we're going to see a lot of folks at the state or district level exercise that kind of leadership in the bold way that I think our kids and communities need, quite frankly.
I don't know where you came down on the question when we talked last time. You were on the show a while back. And I think then I was peppering you with questions around who would want to take a superintendency job. And I had a very negative kind of outlook on it just because I've seen superintendent changes up close before. And I know what it takes to look for someone. And then I know what it takes to land them. And I've seen just, in a limited way, I've seen kind of a rotating pool of candidates nationally. But I've also watched superintendents get squeezed out, be made to retire early or get frustrated or just, and unfortunately, I feel like it's the ones who wanted to make the biggest changes or do the most or the most kind of dedicated to seeing all sides and kind of, and they're ones who get pushed out. So now, with Chicago, we have Janice Jackson, who's said that she's not going to re-up her contract. She came up through the system, not some wild brand outsider that came in to shake things up or anything, came from the inside, grew all the way up. We have a superintendent in Denver who had the exact same story, woman of color, came up through the ranks within the system that she was leading, and understood educators and parents and teaching and learning, not some kind of interloper. Valeria Silva in St. Paul, same kind of story. A woman of color came up through the ranks, started as an aide, a classroom aide in the district, and made it all the way up to superintendent. Came to this country with no English and rose through the ranks to become the leader of the organization. The teachers or the union ran a slate of candidates to oust her, specifically on the platform of outing her, or getting her out of the district. They paid her $750,000 to walk away. Now, I just given you 3 women of color, great, exceptional leaders who came up through the ranks and weren't some wild, crazy, reform-minded people in 3 different districts in 3 different parts of country. One, the second, what is Chicago? Third largest school district?
Third.
Third largest district in the country.
New York, LA, Chicago, Miami.
Yeah, and one of the
Something
oldest. Is that a trend, or am I just making a pattern where there may not be one?
So part of the challenge actually is that there isn't a lot of good data on the superintendency. And I was actually talking to a reporter, Ed Week, about this. There's not a lot of good data on it. But I think we can definitely surmise, where there's smoke, there's fire. And women in the superintendency tend to get scrutinized much more than white men do. And people of color and the leaders of color in the superintendency tend to get scrutinized much more than white men do, right? This is America. That's the way we roll. And so we're definitely seeing that in female leaders of color in these systems, and it's a really troubling trend. And then the question becomes, leadership of a school system is not just about the superintendency, and that's one of the big problems. We're always looking for the savior, but the only decision that a school board member, that a superintendent gets to make totally on their own is a school day. Right? Is a snow day? Sorry,
Mm.
that's the only decision. Right? Everything else is subject to rules, whether it's collective bargaining, whether it is the school board, of course, whether it's the local funding authority, whether informally it's the people you got to check off the box with when you're making a decision. So to enable a superintendent to be successful is a collective leadership question for a community. And then it becomes really easy to turn on leaders if they don't do what it is that you want them to do, right? And when they're leaders of color, they have a bigger target on their back. And when they're female
Hmm.
leaders, and it's a shame. That's but that's what happens in corporate America. That's what happens all over this country. And you started the question, Chris, by asking about who wants to be a superintendent. And what I found is that there are some people out there who are just amazingly driven, passionate people. I think about Greg Hutchins in Alexandria. I think about Susan Enfield in Highline, Khalid Mumit. There's a long list of these people who are such equity-minded leaders who will do whatever it takes and are smart as hell and will get it done. And then there's some people who just do it because they just feel like it's the next step in their career. And maybe the school board, feels like there's someone that can, do it, just follow their bidding, right? And they don't really have a vision for kids, but they want to do the job for whatever reason. And they're not the ones that you need in the places that are the most complex, and need an equity-minded leader. But there are always people who want to do the job. Whether it's the right people is the important question. And I'll stop on this: whether the systems of support and the conditions of success are clear and understood by folks on the school board in particular, but others as well. They're really creating the conditions for a leader to succeed, I think, is what you have to ask. In Chicago, in Denver, and Seattle, Boston, we're seeing it, and there's a pattern there that you're absolutely right. The women of color in the superintendency tend to get scrutinized more, and subject to all the dynamics around race and gender that we have in leadership in this country, and it's a shame.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. So I know Brenda Casilius personally from Boston. Not from Boston, she's from Minnesota, but she's leading in Boston. And then Denise Juneau in Seattle underwent some form of scrutiny. I wasn't deep in the story, but it does feel like it's a pattern in multiple places. I've said this several times, though. When you're interviewing superintendents, they're interviewing you too. I don't think that local boards, local people pay attention as much to the fact that you're not just giving a job to somebody. They're making phone calls too, and they're calling around. And if you have a secretly known dysfunctional board of wackos, they know that too. It's not like you're looking to give somebody a job. Like, oh, you should, So don't get that reputation as a city. Don't get that reputation.
That's right. And no superintendent that's got a good job that's worth their salt is going to go into a public process, for one, where it's a popularity contest or a beauty pageant, right? And they're going to do their due diligence. You're absolutely right. They're going to make calls. They're going to take a look. They're going to see, okay, wait a second, is this a board I want to work for? What do I need to know behind the scenes? And school boards, frankly, shoot themselves in the foot by creating these processes that do not attract the best people necessarily. If you're looking for an outside candidate, we are starting to see a trend. And again, this is just anecdotally, just kind of watching that has more hires from within, which I think is a very good thing in lots of ways. Even though I was always a superintendent that came from the outside. Depending on the context, depending on what the district needs, there are benefits and drawbacks to both approaches. But we are starting to see more folks come from within, which can be very effective. But then there's the question around, do they only know the one way of doing business? And is that way of doing business the way, what the school system actually needs in order to be successful going forward? And school boards have to weigh all of that when they're making a selection for the next soup.
Yeah, I hope that districts pay attention in cities beyond just the school board, that mayors, city council members, all the people realize that they have a collective interest in putting out the red carpet and letting people know, if you come here, you won't be standing alone on the schools. You won't be standing alone. We work as a team. And our mayor did that in Minneapolis, I think twice. We had a mayor who stepped in and basically said, I'm the mayor of this city. I'm deeply involved and interested in education. I'm not involved to the point where I have any power. Like, I don't micromanage the schools or anything, but if you need something, call me. And if there's ever a political problem, we're together, right? That is actually a great way to sell this, I think, to the outside. I should make a program note here. Jason Allen in Atlanta is an educator there in Atlanta. He works with young people. They're hosting a forum tonight, what Gen Z wants in a superintendent. And he said to check it out. Jason, if you have any link for that or any way for people to see it, drop it into the comments and we'll take a look. He works with young people in Atlanta to think about school issues, and they've gotten very involved, even in these type of issues.
That's great. Yeah, I love that. I mean, when I was superintendent of Montgomery County, I did a lot of work with student groups, and they were just, they were the smartest stakeholders in many ways. They were the most thoughtful. I always used to tell the local press that the best coverage of the budget and of school issues was typically from students. I used to meet with the editorial boards. They'll tell you what's up. It's interesting just going back, we said about the role of mayors. It's absolutely true what you said, that the mayors can create the conditions, but you then look at what just happened in New York with de Blasio's micromanagement of Rich Carranza. Right. And so, the Bloomberg Klein approach, which, I worked in that administration for a short period of time, was the right approach in lots of ways in terms of giving the chancellor some, the right role, the right leeway. You always knew Bloomberg ultimately had authority, but Joel had an enormous field to play in, whereas de Blasio did micromanage the hell out of Carranza. And that was a real problem.
The micromanaging of the mayor. So let me just ask about the chancellor. Of the chancellor. Right. Do you think that there's any difference between a school district that has an appointed board or authority and a strong mayor versus ones that do elected, like boards, and the mayor's kind of hands off?
Yeah, so I've written about this before. I'm a proponent of an appointed board. I actually think that boards should be appointed kind of like the Fed, right? 6-year cycles, off-year elections, and with specific roles that they have to fulfill. Parent leader, community leaders, business leaders, whatever it might be. They have to have a certain amount of credentials. And I think that there should be, the funding authority and the mayor should do the appointment. I think that's part of the problem we have in public schools, is that you have a funding authority, like a city council, whatever it may be, county council, that gets to decide about how much tax dollars are going to go to the school system. But then you have a completely different governance structure that decides how that money is going to be spent and who's going to do the administration of it. And it creates unnecessary tension. I think the funding authority should appoint a school board, and they should be more along the lines of a kind of corporate board, or a nonprofit board. I think that would make a lot more. But you have to have the right roles. So you have to have parents in there. You have to have students in there. But the politics of boards are so extreme. I don't think people realize the depth of what superintendents have to go through in managing the care and feeding of their board members, and the other elected officials. And it's not good for kids. It's not good for adults either. And it's not good for families. It's part of the reason why so many families of color have been left out of the equation, right? Because they just don't have the political power. And when they try to get it, they're either tokenized or pushed to the side, right? And the only way you do something about that is by actually having, on one hand, you want you want the public to elect the right people, but only about 5% of people actually vote in a school board election if it's an off year, if it's not in a presidential year, something like that. So it's a very small number of people. It's down below on the ballot. People don't really know who's running for the board, right? So while it's this supposed, symbol of democracy, it's nothing close to being that. And if you actually want to give power to the people who are most affected, an appointed board will do that, more so than an elected one will. Not a very popular opinion, but
it's not a popular opinion.
Right. I mean, unless you can get enough people to actually care about a school board election and to put the right people in the seat, you're going to continue to have what we've always had, which is just the maintenance of the status quo by who gets elected.
I think what's really interesting about that. So years ago, Michael Casserly at the Council of Great City Schools did a report on this question, like what was best for students, appointed or elected or whatnot. They didn't really find any difference in achievement, like in outcomes, what structure you had, but they did find different differences. Some, it seemed like, nuances about who gets elected and who gets appointed based upon whether, maybe it's better for women of color, for instance, that you have an appointed board because someone's always going to balance that out where voters might not. There were things also around, like if you have at-large elections versus district-based elections, people of color fare better in at-large elections, which I thought was really interesting, but no real outcome in terms of student achievement. And I watch right now, there are people in Chicago right now who are pushing to go back to have an elected board now. And that's becoming a thing in Chicago. And it's real funny because there's the people in other places that are pushing to have an appointed board. Same types of communities, same types of demographics. They just don't want what they currently have. Right. It's kind of like a grass is greener thing.
Yeah, the other issue is just around speed of decision making, right? One of the things they talk about in the corporate world all the time, fail fast, right, and all that. You're not able to, in school districts under the typical structure where it can take months and months to make a decision because of all of the guardrails that are on the superintendent, right? You want to adopt a new curriculum, you want to start a new initiative, there's all these layers of decision making you have to jump through, and many of those are very good, right? They take into account constituents and stakeholder perspectives. They follow the rules so that you don't have nepotism, and procurement rules are important so that you don't waste money and you're beholden to the public. But it also slows things down, and sometimes you just want to be able to move. And when you have an appointed board, or when the superintendent is part of the mayor's team, you can just move more quickly, and there is value in that. Now, there has to be accountability on the other side, right? There absolutely has to be accountability, but things move slowly in public education because it's designed that way, right? And that's a huge part of the challenge that superintendents face.
Isn't a part of that, it's a knife that cuts two directions? Isn't part of that the idea that you don't want somebody coming in doing really wild and wacky stuff? I mean, listen, like at the very, very top of the United States political heap, we just went through 4 years of what it looks like to have a bull in the china shop, right? Right. So some safeguards around, you won't have the Trumpian superintendent who comes in and starts making everybody wear hoods, is kind of like a good, it's a good slowing down thing. I don't know how to put it.
Yeah, I mean, sure. That is that's certainly something that has to be taken into account. I would argue that thankfully most people aren't Donald Trump, and aren't going to act that way. And look, I wish there were a simple answer to this. It's not like there's just one way of doing business. It's just some of the frustration that people feel towards superintendents, which then gets manifest in ousting them and beating them up. I mean, there are death threats against superintendents this year, right? There have been people put in terrible positions. Is that people don't understand how the system works and where the accountability is and how decisions get made. And so, look, when you take the top position, you're responsible, right? That's the way it goes. Give everybody else credit and you take full responsibility. And you got to learn to manage and lead that way. But there are some things that the superintendent just can't control or would want to do differently if they were if they had the authority to. And that can pose a huge challenge for them, and they get blamed for stuff that sometimes isn't their fault because
Hmm.
they didn't have the full authority to make that kind of decision.
It almost feels like
Yeah,
you purposely pay a superintendent $300,000 to be the fall guy for 3 years,
yeah.
and then they move on and do it somewhere else. I mean, and you can only take so much of having a kid at home. Theoretically, you're a
Mhm.
married superintendent who has to worry about your kid in their own school
Mhm.
and worry about your own family and get called a jackass one time too many on things that aren't even your problem, but you're really well paid. So you just do it
Mhm.
for 3 years. You get that $300,000 a year. It's like what, 900K you make in 3 years. And then you move on to the next city, do it again. And that becomes part of the circuit. Like, I'm going to take your crap for literally 3-4 years. Maybe if you get a good board who are super supportive, I might stay 5. But the
Yeah.
parents are going to drive me crazy. The teachers are going to drive me crazy. The press, the media is going to drive me crazy. And then I'm going to leave.
So I think there's some slash and burn superintendents out there. I've seen that particularly in the sort of advent of the No Child Left Behind era, right? Guys like Rudy Crew, and I have a lot of respect for Rudy, and his fierce intelligence and his commitment to equity, but he also never backed down from a fight, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's harder to not fight than it is to fight, right? And sometimes, you get in a situation where you stand on your hill and you say, well, this is what's good for kids, and it's my way, the highway. If you don't agree with me, then it's not good for kids. And you realize that's not your job, right? You're a steward of the community's values, and your job is to bring people along and to push and pull and cajole. And sometimes you got to take a stand and say, yeah, this is the way it's going to be. But you also have to work within the community. And the slash and burn superintendents, um, are good at moving around every 3-4 years, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
really good ones, they don't want to do that because the job is so hard that once you get in, you want to see it through. And even if you've been there for 6 years or 7 years, it's not done. And moving around like that, it's hard. And the financial incentives, if you stay within the state, great, because you can stay in your pension. But if you don't, then it can be a huge challenge anyway to move around. So I don't know that superintendents think that way or want to do that. I think sometimes they find themselves in that situation because they're really good at fighting, but not really good at building coalitions to support the work.
Do you think that the role of the superintendent is equally challenging across like affluent districts and non-affluent districts, but just different? Like they're both, you're still having to deal with parents in both an affluent district and a non-affluent district. The challenges that they present you with are just different. Or do you think it gets gradually easier the more affluent the district becomes? Like your role is less challenging.
So I think I would argue that the more actual diversity you have in a school system is directly related to the complexity and difficulty of the job. So whether that's affluence or whether it's just simply, um, you know, homogeneity in a system, because you can have a rural district that has, a lot of rural poor white people, right? That may be easier than a district that is a lot more, because assuming that there are shared interests, right? That's the biggest challenge I see, Chris, is that in the districts that have true diversity, right, where it, it, the biggest issue in New York City right now, and New York City doesn't really have true diversity, but it's this issue around the the entrance tests for the specialized high schools, right? That's because a
Mm-hmm.
small number of people wield an enormous amount of power,
Mm-hmm.
right? When I was in Stamford, Connecticut, which was very very diverse, just like Montgomery County, very very diverse. The different ways that people exercise their political power and their truly different interests that they had are what make the job so complicated. And trying to get people who don't live together, don't worship together, don't play together, don't do anything together except be in school to actually have a shared vision of what schools should do for kids is a huge challenge.
Mm.
So,
So
now look,
integration is bad.
No, I didn't say
I
that.
was
Come
trying to
on,
trick you,
man.
man.
Come on.
I mean,
Well,
well, listen, Carol Burris, she doesn't talk to me anymore and has blocked me on Twitter for years now.
right.
But when I was a school board member, I brought some of Carol Burris's work to the school board to say, listen, if you're going to detrack classes,
Right.
don't think that it's a pedagogical change intervention. It's a political one. Watch what happens. And
Well,
people didn't really listen, and all hell broke loose, right? Like they detracked classes and all hell broke loose. It became one of the,
well, so it's interesting because Carol, I used Carol's work in Rockville Center when I was doing my work in Stanford to detrack classes. And Carol's the work Carol does now is the work Carol does now.
yeah.
And whatever you want it is what it is. But I give her a lot of credit, and the superintendent, for detracking that school. And I modeled some of the work that I did in Stanford, and I brought in her colleague Delia. And the white people, the powerful white people in Stanford, they said, "Oh, well, Rockville Center only, they don't have as many kids of color as we do, so it's completely different. It's Long Island. It's not Connecticut. It really." But Carol did great work around detracking, and it is both a political issue and a teaching and learning issue, right? Without a doubt, it's all about teaching and learning. So
Well, I mean,
separate issue.
I think the way I connect the issue to this conversation is just I watched it happen in real time in a district that wasn't mostly white, but had very white, powerful parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched them get a principal fired because the principal had set up all of these the principal had been put into a segregated school that white people abandoned. So she said, if you're going to put me here, I'm going to build programs for these kids and they're going to excel. And they did. They started taking off. And then the district changed school boundaries and pushed white people into that school because the boundaries changed. And suddenly those parents were like, you have honors for all? You've got these kids in my kids' class who can't keep up and blah, blah, blah. And short story is how politics work. That principal was fired and let go. And you have a superintendent of color who is hearing from white parents, you're being racist against our kids because our kids are more advanced than those other kids doesn't mean we're racist. It turned into this big weird thing. And I could just see behind closed doors how superintendents process that sort of thing. Like, man, I don't want to be doing this for the rest of my life.
Well, as someone who did that kind of thing, I mean, that's what I did in Stanford, right? And I knew that was not going to be my job forever, right? I knew that I would be there for a certain amount of time and that I was there to do a certain job. So I'm not religious at all, but I always tell superintendents, you have to know if you're going to be Moses or you're going to be Joshua, right? Are you, the metaphor is like, are you the one who breaks them out and brings them somewhere? Or is your leadership about actually, helping them with the new world? And so I knew when I was in Stanford, I was much more Moses, right? I was breaking down the system. And again, I shy away from religious. It's a good leadership one, right? You have to break down things, you break a lot of eggs, whatever it may be. You got to break down systems, build up new ones. You're going to get a lot of enemies, and you got to have a plan. Again, Rudy Crew, right? You're going to get fired, so you might as well choose what you're going to get fired over. And you have to have an exit strategy as well. Like superintendents think about entering, you also have to have an exit strategy. When you're doing that work, you have to have this kind of long-term strategy to understand what's eventually going to happen and to set the systems up so that someone else can then take the reins and be the Joshua who's going to actually see it through. So you have to be sort of strategic as you think about that work, because if you just stand up and fight over it, it's not going to be long lasting, and leaders have to consider that. And superintendents, you got to know what you're getting yourself into, and you have to understand all the different, consequences of making a decision. You have to be a long-term strategic thinker when it comes to that.
I got so many questions for you around some of this. I do have, well, let me just start with this one. Forecasting to the future, forecasting to the fall. What's the superintendent that our kids deserve? What's the superintendent this fall who gets the challenge of the moment well enough to lead kind of districts through a time of renewal? I don't know what you would call it, a moment of renewal or a remediation. Take us to the fall and tell us what's your kind of leadership outlook.
So I think that in a certain way, it's no different than what it's always been, right? When I was in Montgomery County, I made it very clear that every single one of our children needs to be in a school where they feel loved, valued, and respected. Those who are closest to the work should be leading the work and solving problems. And as a superintendent, your job is to make the other people, the people around you, is to help them do their best work. And so while that may have manifested in things like reducing disproportionality and suspensions, a few years ago, now it looks like responding to the collective trauma that we've all gone through. And if you so someone like Susan Enfield out in Highline, right, talks about knowing every kid by strength, need, and name. That kind of ethos, that value system, that leadership, and the symbolism of saying that over and over and over means that whether it's an academic issue, whether it's a social emotional issue, whether it's a mental health issue, which is different than social emotional health, right, is essential to understanding where our kids are and where our adults are. And I do think that the other piece is leaders need to focus more and more on adult needs going forward, right? And I hate the dichotomy of, children first, forget about adult needs. We haven't been focused on kids. And there's reality to that, of course, right? We know that too many kids haven't been served well enough in our schools because of the inability of adults to actually get off their crap, right? But if you don't have happy adults who feel like they're able to do the job and feel like they're part of it, they're not going to serve kids well. And there's going to be a degree of flexibility that leaders are going to need. They're really going to have to listen to folks in their schools and engage their teachers and their parents. And they're going to have to understand that people are still in a time of fear. And when people are fearful, you have to listen to them and acknowledge them and really try to understand them so you can move them to where we want to go.
Yeah, I think this isn't one of my strong suits. One of my strong suits is not listening to the complaints of teachers. And here's why. You just said that you think there's some truth to needing to put kids first. My analysis of the situation is that if you're a teacher, by state law, that means that you're college educated. That means you've already crossed through one of the rungs that many of your kids are never going to cross through and never be able to get your position. And in social work, you have this sense of like, if you're not well, you shouldn't be doing social work, because if you're not well, you can't focus on the thing that's really the main thing. The only reason a social worker exists is because families need a service that is really important to their survival. So if you're having a bad day, or you got divorced, or you have something going on in life, it's like social workers are supposed to tap themselves out. Like you deserve a better social worker than me right now. In teaching, it just feels like the rub for me of this becomes the racial equity rub. That like we can't get adults to focus on equity enough without at some point resisting just the basics of what you need to do. We have entire school systems where the teachers don't want to take these basic inventories to uncover bias and stuff like that.
Right.
That becomes a real problem for me in this fall, because I think the numbers are going to shake out. It's not going to surprise anybody what the numbers shake out, but I just think we're going to find out what we already should be knowing right now, which is the equity catastrophe is kind of like really going to be very strong for us. We're going to have to figure this out in the fall, and we're going to need everybody on board. And we can't be sitting around saying like, can I coax you into caring?
Yeah. So Chris, so the equity catastrophe has already been there forever, right? We were designed that way. It is more present now than ever before. And I don't want to in any way, shape, or form suggest that I'm making excuses for adults, or saying, oh, all teachers and all principals and all superintendents are great and all that kind of stuff. They're not at all. But there's a false dichotomy that we've created, that it's either the needs of adults or the needs of kids. And in any organization, if you don't have engaged employees who feel that they are capable of doing the work before them and they're supported in doing it, they're not going to be able to perform at the level you need them to get to. So simply creating, and that's what the slash and burn superintendents do, right? They create the hill and they say, well, follow me up the hill. And if you're not going to die on there with me, if you're not going to go up there with me, then you're not worth anything. And then people are saying, wait a second, I don't know that I actually can get up that hill. I don't know, right? So, and maybe that analogy is the best one, but folks are, if you assume that most teachers want to do the right thing by kids, and even if they went to college, they simply may not know how, because we know the results of too many educator prep programs. We know how much schools have to invest in teacher professional learning in order to get better. Um, White people are afraid to death of equity and issues of racism, right? We have to get over that. And there is some coaxing, right, that has to be done. I mean, I think that there's some pushing and there's some demands that have to be made, and white leaders need to make those demands upon white educators, and white leaders who are working with a superintendent of color need to protect them, right, so that the superintendent of color isn't the only one that's ringing the equity bell.
Mhm.
Um, but if we don't have adults that are able to do the work before them, if they don't know how to do it, then what are you stuck with, right? You can't just go and you can't just go and find another teacher. You got who you got, and you got to figure out a way to pull them along. And I don't want that to sound like a compromise. It's just the reality of managing talent, right? You got to shift we have to shift the distribution of average
Mhm.
of educators in our country, and there's some incremental work there, even though it's not going to go as fast as either you or I would like.
What do you think is going to be the role of data, coming this fall? Well, I
You know,
don't want to keep talking about the fall like it's this magic time, but just moving forward, what is
yeah.
data going to do for us?
You know what's fascinating? So I've been writing my book and I've been interviewing a bunch of superintendents, and every single one of them keeps coming back to data as they're talking about all this other stuff. They're talking about culture and talent management, resource allocation, and I think the smart superintendents out there have already dismissed state test scores as worthless, right? Because we all know they are not measuring anything. They have been putting in place um,
My
formative
God,
assessments.
Joshua, you're going to give me a heart attack here.
Oh, I know,
Okay,
I know.
slow
I
down
just
just
want
on this
to,
one point.
yeah.
They've given up on it for this year because there's been too few people like participating or whatever, or they've determined that they were useless tools, period.
Both, both.
Really? Wow.
State test scores
Okay.
have been useless for a long time. Other than understanding at an aggregate level where we should
Yeah.
focus, where we should ask some more questions about what a school dynamic may be, but they've never been good at actually measuring the individual learning of a student or a class or a teacher or even a school, right? They're entry points into a larger conversation about what's actually happening. At best, the data
Yeah.
help you ask
Wow.
better questions, right?
Yeah.
That's what they do. And any good school system has been using other forms of data all along the way, right? Whether it is, people don't like it when I say that the map is actually, it's a pretty solid assessment, or whether they design their own formative assessments based on their curriculum. And some schools have been doing a really good job of that. And, so the good systems have always done that anyway. And I think we're going to see more of that. I'm hoping that folks will use like the work we did in Montgomery County around early warning indicator systems, where you actually link your understanding of a child's academic progress to their behavioral metrics, which are not only referrals and things like that, but also absences. You can link that to other social service agencies within your community to understand what a family story might be, because the data help you understand a child's story. So I think the role of data is going to continue to loom large, but I think much of it has to be based on where is the child academically relative to standards, and what supports may they need. Does the measure actually measure that, right? Is it valid and
Mm.
reliable? If we're looking at math, if we're looking at literacy, which the state tests don't do. And then what else do we need to know about that child and their family, so that we don't just give them a reading tutor if it's a social emotional need, whatever it may be. So I think data is going to continue to loom large, but we're going to have to get much more granular and understand each child's story. And the best schools are already doing that, right? They
Mhm.
already know
Mhm.
each one of their children, their families.
I think that superintendents have to model a much better discussion with their public about data.
Yes.
I think they have to model it. They have to and it has to be a truthful, honest,
Mm-hmm.
evidence-based discussion that is told in a way that a seventh grader could understand. That's the
Yes.
challenge. It's got to be simplified, but it has to be truthful, and it has to involve journalists and other politicians. I would love for all of Cleveland as a city to be on one page with how it talks about educational data. When you talk about tests matter or don't matter, which ones?
Mhm.
And why are you doing these 5? Why are you doing, NWEA or MAP or STAR test or MAC tests here in Minnesota? Tell us the MCCs, here. Let's have an honest conversation that makes the public smarter over time, which I think is completely possible. But you can't do it if your journalists are going one direction. You've got teachers unions going a different direction. You have parents in Facebook groups like saying that all testing is child abuse. You have people not understanding the difference between formative and summative assessments.
Yep.
They really, what people don't understand is the difference between correlation and causation.
Yep.
So I haven't seen a superintendent yet say, I'm going to lead as a project. I'm going to spend the next year working with my media and my other elected officials and others to model a smart conversation, with one exception. Tell me do you know Strive, like out of Ohio? Did you ever care about that? Did that ever make sense to you that like maybe we would have one database as a city and we would have everybody sitting with one database of information?
I'm a former accountability guy, right? And I always just tell people the best data help you ask better questions. And I exactly what you're saying, Chris, about the sort of black box of accountability systems, that I would always tell my people, like, the bigger the black box, and the more data we're using, the black box gets bigger. People don't understand it, and we need to make it simple. And I would also put out, to look, when you're looking at 7 subgroups by how testing 3rd through 8th grade and then one high school, something like more than 1,000 data points. So which one do you want me to focus on, right? So I think this is what I did when I was in Montgomery County, an early warning indicator system where we could. And we just sort of started the work and got it off the ground before the school board, decided that they wanted to go in a different direction. But it enabled us to take key metrics, right, for each child and understand whether or not they were on track to graduate on time. You build a structure that brings in other kinds of information. So we had agreements from the county health department and recreation department and folks like that. We started mapping out, okay, here are the kids who are least likely to graduate on time if they stay on this track. Where are the social services that are near them? What does transportation look like in that community? Is there housing insecurity? All those kinds of stuff. You can build those systems. They're not that complicated, frankly. We don't have enough of those out there, but there should be one data set that pulls in any government-funded action. It also will make things much more efficient. You're getting me on my soapbox now because I get this whole vision for this thing, right? But
I'm like with you on this vision. I've talked to Paige Kowalski about this. We should have a community data trust in every city.
Oh, absolutely.
Our communities are the most studied communities in the world, and it's all the information's behind a firewall.
Right. Well, you just look at things like, like poverty rates. Like we look at, free and reduced price meals, and that's one indicator. But there's so much when you drill down and look at, abject poverty. I mean, there's so many other indicators. That data exists out there in some government-funded spreadsheet, and people use rules that they don't understand well and say, well, we can't share that kind of data. No, actually, you can. Part of it is, I will also say, working in public systems, there is no incentive to invest in data infrastructure, because if you have to buy an upgrade to your data system or buy a new teacher, you're going to go with the teacher every time, right? And so a lot of these transactional databases are old. The analytical databases that sit on top of them, they're old. They've been pulled together with Scotch tape and chewing gum. And there's not a lot of sophisticated knowledge about how to make them better and how to use them better. It's why RPPs are so important, but we need a much, much different approach to how we manage and integrate
it seems
data.
Like that's a point of innovation. That's a point where we need, and there might be some creative ways of getting it. When I say community data trust, first of all, the public pays for a lot of data that's already collected that they don't have access to. So it's not creating anything new. It's like you can, in Minneapolis, for instance, great example, Minneapolis has a massive university in the city that couldn't be more of like a non-player in the city that it's in. This big, beautiful, massive campus that we all pay for, but there are kids that are 3 blocks away that are getting no benefit from that big monstrosity sitting in the middle of the city. And they have so much information that they study, the poorest zip codes and do all this work, environmental work, work on the kids and blah, 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 studying it. It's all behind a firewall. Why is it behind a firewall? That's public information. Why wouldn't an activist in Minneapolis who wants to be one of the smartest citizens they could be have access to all of the information that the government has collected about their schools, their children, their water, their city services? But I just don't think it's anybody's job right now. No one's like the evangelist, the data evangelist right now.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, let's play that out, right? One is there are some superintendents out there who understand that they need to work on those things, but they're few and far between. It's really hard. You don't learn in superintendent school, and there are a lot of universities that have no interest whatsoever in participating. Although more and more are starting to look at things like research practice partnerships. That's one. It's hard work. It's while it may be innovative, you need to get someone who really understands it, who can do that kind of work and invest in it. Two, public education was, and like all public institutions in America, was intentionally designed to oppress many and privilege few. So why would we want to create more transparency, right? It will just show all of the long-standing problems, and that the system would then have to do something about, which then gets back into the previous conversation we were having about where the power lies, right? So if you expose a problem, you have to do something about it. I mean, name and claim it, right? And being able to do something about it means you have to go against the politically powerful, and that's a huge challenge. So that's why people don't want to share stuff enough.
Yeah, well, we have to demand sunlight from our government, like just as good citizens. My name is Citizen Stewart Online. I actually take very seriously, like, being a good citizen is a thing. It's a thing you aspire to do. One of those things is being informed about your government so that you can do your job of holding it accountable for what it's supposed to be. Like, it's supposed to be, the consent of the governed. You can't have consent if you're not educated about what the government is doing. We've had weird things happen, like in Minnesota, where the state government gave school boards temporary ability to have private meetings, like closed door meetings, and avoid the open meeting law and stuff like that, because they wanted to discuss things in their labor contract that they didn't think the public would like. I can't think of a bigger kind of like red flag when your government says, no, we're going to need for a short period of time to give just the St. Paul School Board the ability to meet behind closed doors without the public knowing.
So that's where I will say,
here it comes.
Well, no, and again, I wish there were just a simple answer to this. On one hand, sure, you need maximum transparency, but on the other hand, as someone who had to deal with that all the time, there are sometimes you need to be able to have a conversation in private about really serious issues, because there's no easy answer. And partially it's, the media will just pull one thread, right? They'll just seize on one piece of it and make that the whole story. And now you have, of course, the citizen journalists, whether they're posting on Facebook, whatever else, they don't understand the gestalt. So on one hand, the leaders have to be really good at explaining to people the gestalt. But if you can't have a conversation in private about really complex, difficult issues, and you can't say, Chris really isn't doing a good job at that school, and I need to move him. I think he might do better in another school. If you can't have that kind of conversation in private, then you are, challenging the ability to make really good decisions. And it's a balance that you have to strike, right? Not everything should be in private, but leaders also need to be able to have really hairy conversations, really complex conversations in private. Not all of it. We need transparency, but you can't do everything in public.
Well, I've been in many of those conversations, from like closed door sessions, executive sessions on things involving the superintendent or teachers that were doing bad things in the district. I said to myself all those times, like, I'm a public citizen. Now I'm on this board, but I'm still a public citizen, and I'm shocked by some of what I'm seeing and hearing. And I wonder what the public would think about the fact that we do business like this on some of the things that we know would be damaging to the public's, like the public would. So So definitely some things, not everything can take place in open view. I definitely think when you're going to put the public on the hook for like a labor contract, that should be at very least on cable access. The public should hear and see what goes on in that room. And I know here locally, when parents did start going to those meetings and start seeing what was being said, it changed what people had been saying privately for years in those meetings, which was problematic. The things they had been saying in those rooms for years was problematic. They did change their behavior. I think they did get a bit more performative. So there is a downside to it, because now that you know that people are watching, you probably will get more performative. But this is just like a tension of many tensions. I know we're going to run on time here. I do want to ask you about this question, though, not this specifically, because it just leads to all the tensions that a superintendent has to solve. I give all these tensions between wanting the public to know enough, but not wanting your crazy kind of Facebooker to go and take something and cause you a 10-year problem that you didn't need. Right. That's totally, it happens. Like you get some overactive Facebookers that will ruin a whole plan. I've seen that happen too. Yep. Well, I want to ask you about a couple other tensions that all pop up, and they're all underneath the bucket of tension. Just things like when I first came into the district, they were trying to decide a math curriculum and they were having a fight about it. And it was my first introduction into, oh, you guys fight about this stuff. Like I thought there was just some smart way to choose one. They did the same with the reading curriculum. They're doing the same now with things around like critical race theory or how you teach diversity. It almost seems like everything's a war that I wouldn't have known until I like came into the room on some of those things. What do you think the good superintendent's going to do to end some of these constant wars? I don't know that anybody's going to do anything to end the forever ones, but how do you handle these tensions?
So, and there's actually a relationship between the sort of transparency issue and this one, right? Most people are silent but reasonable. They're not going to raise their hands. They're not going to get involved. Not going to go to school board meetings, but they want a reasonable explanation to what's happening. And I think it's the same thing when we have these big issues around curriculum, around anti-bias instruction or culturally competent instruction, or, I mean, no one's really doing critical race theory, but these conversations about how do we address race. I think that the best superintendents are very, very clear about what's non-negotiable, right? And say we will have a standards-based curriculum that reflects not only state standards, but the highest standards of the whatever association may be give the imprimatur, like National Council of Teachers of English or something like that. And we'll be very clear about what the decision-making process is going to be, who gets to decide what the implementation cycle will be, when will teachers get a new curriculum, how will they be able to adjust and readjust, what authority will they have, how much training will they have, what supports will there be for kids who need to be accelerated, what supports will there be for kids who have already passed the standard, right? So there's a process issue around transparency and decision making, and there's no one way to make the decision, but the superintendent has to be very clear about what their job is, and their job is to define the problem. Right? This is the problem we are trying to solve, and this is why we are now choosing a new math curriculum. This is what we intend to do it, and this is what you can expect of me along the way. Right. And I think that's what the best leaders always do. They're absolutely clear about their non-negotiable stakes in the ground. That yes, we were going to have a curriculum in mathematics that gives every single child access to algebra by 8th grade. Right. That is non-negotiable. Yes, we are going to then disaggregate the data to determine which kids are actually getting right. You can be clear about that, but then also give people at the ground level some real clear opportunity to lead and make decisions as they see fit, because otherwise you're just going to then say in 3 years, oh, we didn't implement with fidelity. Let's go on to the next one. Let's waste some more dollars and go on to and just create that churn. So you have to be really clear up front about what the problem is you're trying to solve and what the process is you're going to use to make the decision.
Yeah, maybe another day we could talk about what makes for a decisive leader too, who says at the end of the day, I make the decision. Right. Well, the math example that I gave you, what happened in that situation was there was one math curriculum that was more text heavy, and there was one that was more kind of straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a mix of schools. Our more fluent schools wanted the more text heavy one. It was one that they liked. There was a 10-year contract you had to sign for the curriculum, and you wouldn't know until year 6 whether or not it was working. The vendor couldn't provide you with any "has this worked" type of information. And I was like, whoa, I didn't know that this is how this goes. And what they eventually did was they picked the middle of the road curriculum that mixed a little of the both, but it satisfied no one. Satisfied no one. It was terrible.
Well, so I'll give you 2 quick examples. I know we're running out of time, but when I was in Montgomery County, we did the reduced disproportionality of suspensions. That was non-negotiable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what was non-negotiable is that every school that we would focus on relationships in every school, and that kids would feel valued, loved, and respected. Because if you do that, you can end up reducing suspensions. How schools went about doing that was up to them. They had the resources of the equity team, they had the clear message, we had the data, but how they went about it had to be something that they embraced as a school, because every school culture is different. Same with the detrack and work in Stanford, right? That was non-negotiable. We were going to detrack, but how we went about it, what the teaching and learning would look like, things like that was something that you have to get folks at the ground level. So the best leaders are the ones who, and I don't put myself in this category necessarily, but the best leaders from what I've seen are the ones that are absolutely non-negotiable about what adults will do in service of children. Absolutely right. This is what I expect every adult to do, and this is where I expect every child to get to. But how schools go about it is where the magic happens in some ways. It's not really magic, it's science. But that's really where the rubber hits the road. And you have to let school communities and have very clear, that's some of the work that Jen Cheatham did. We were talking about Jen Cheatham in Madison. Madison. If you look at the way that she shifted her strategic planning work and the way they helped schools organize themselves, not to impose a one way of doing business, but to create a process where that school community would organize around a Black excellence agenda, right? That's the secret sauce and the work that leaders like Jen did, and some of the best leaders out there have done.
I love that you say that it's not magic, it's science. For some people, science is magic. We're learning that more and more every day. Well, great. I appreciate this conversation so much. I think it should keep going. I think the superintendency is, while we focus so much on teachers and data and schools, we focus very little on leadership and what it means for the next generation and where those leaders are going to come from. What's your big marker that you're putting out? What's your North Star at PDK? And just as Josh Starr, a thinker, Joshua Starr, Dr. Starr, the thinker, the man, the myth, the legend, what's your North Star leading here for? What do you care about most?
Well, these days we are all about our Educators Rising program, right? Where we are inspiring high school kids to pursue education as a career. And we're spreading throughout the country. We're actually trying to, we're talking to some folks in Minnesota. You and I should talk about that offline. But 52% of our kids are kids of color. We are changing the sort of the face of the next generation of educators, and it is amazing to see. If you just look at our recent student webinar, if you go on the Ed Rising YouTube channel and look at Zane McCory, the way he described what he's learned about history through his Educators Rising class, and he did not realize how biased the history is that he's being taught in schools. And now through the Ed Rising class, he's going to his history teachers and he's like, what's up, right? So, all this garbage about teaching critical race theory or not out there is makes no sense when you listen to our kids who want us to tell them the truth. And I am so inspired by our Educators Rising kids who are saying, hey, not only do I want you to tell me the truth, but I'm going to be an educator who teaches others the truth. And I'm like, that's all our work these days, and a lot of our work these days. And it's so much fun to see our kids and our teachers throughout the country rise to the occasion.
Well, I love it. Please come back and let's talk more about that program specifically too.
Anytime.
I love young voices. I love younger voices, getting them in the pipeline. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's been another great episode of Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. Our guest today has been Dr. Joshua Starr, who is the CEO of PDK International. You can find them online. Please do. You haven't written in a while, Josh. I think your last piece was February. So
no,
at least on the blog.
Yeah.
Did you have something to make?
No, I have a column coming out every month, but
okay.
Yeah, I'll
All
send it
right.
to you. Make sure you
Well,
get it.
send it to me, yes,
Will
because
do.
I look for them on the site there. So, anyways, we appreciate you all for giving us your breakfast time or your mid brunch time every morning to talk about education, because it's the most important conversation we can have. Like, how our kids are doing is the question for the nation. So, thank you all. We appreciate